The screaming began before dawn, thin at first, then tearing, the sound of a body splitting against its own limits. Inside a one-room cabin pressed into the Appalachian slope. A young bride thrashed on a narrow bed soaked through with blood and sweat. Her bones showed beneath skin, pulled too tight, ribs rising and falling like something trying to claw its way out. Each breath rattled. Each scream scraped the walls raw. Outside, the mountains held the sound and gave it back, echoing it into the trees, where frost still clung to the branches. This was not the first scream those hills had swallowed. It would not be the last. The girl's name was Sarah Hutchkins. Though the name had been spoken so many times, in that valley it had begun to lose meaning. Daughter, cousin, bride. The words overlapped the way the bloodlines did. Her hands were clenched around the bedsheet, fingers already bending at angles that weren't meant to exist. Her body had been failing long before this night. Long before the wedding dress, yellowed with age, was pulled over her head. Long before the ring, worn by other women who died young, was slid onto her finger. What was happening now was only the final, visible stage of a decay that had been written into her bones before she ever learned to walk. The air in the cabin smelled of iron and damp wood. Kerosene lamps threw trembling shadows across the walls, shadows that looked like people with twisted spines and shortened limbs, a gallery of shapes the family knew well. Women murmured prayers under their breath. Men stood outside, boots sinking into frozen mud, listening to the sounds and pretending not to understand what they meant. This was childbirth, they told themselves. This was God's will. This was the way it had always been. But even they could hear something was wrong. Before the screams, before the blood, before the marriage that sealed her fate, there was a place that shaped all of it. A county that rarely appeared on maps, where roads thinned into dirt and then disappeared altogether. A place where families stayed folded inward, generation after generation, and where secrets weren't hidden so much as buried under repetition. The Hutchkins had lived there longer than anyone could remember, their name carved again and again into stones on a hillside cemetery, each date marking a life cut short. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The question drifts in quietly, almost apologetically, after the scream fades. Because this story did not begin in that cabin, and it does not belong only to those mountains. It began decades earlier, with choices made in isolation, with marriages arranged without witnesses, with a belief that keeping blood close would keep everything else out. By the time Sarah Hutchkins began to die in earnest, the ground beneath her was already layered, with the consequences of those choices packed down hard by time, waiting to give way. Spring of 1967 came late to Harlan County, Kentucky. Snow lingered in the shadows of the ridges well into March, and the creeks ran dark and swollen with meltwater. The land looked untouched, but that was an illusion created by distance. People had been living in those hollows for generations, leaving marks that didn't show up on maps. Old survey records listed the area as sparsely populated. Church registries told a different story. The same surnames repeated again and again, written in fading ink, looping back on themselves like a hand that refused to let go. The Hutchkins homestead sat above a narrow valley, a cluster of cabins connected by paths only they used. Outsiders called it a compound, though no fence surrounded it. It didn't need one. The mountains did the work. The family had been there since before the Civil War, long enough that stories about their arrival had hardened into something like scripture. Great-grandfather Elijah Hutchkins. According to family law, had chosen the land because it was hidden. He believed survival meant separation. He believed blood should stay close, uncontaminated by strangers who brought new ideas and new weaknesses with them. That belief shaped everything that followed. By the time Sarah Hutchkins was born in 1950, the family tree had stopped branching outward. It folded inward instead, parents sharing grandparents, cousins sharing the same great-grandparents twice, sometimes 3 times over. Names repeated so often that children were given nicknames to keep them straight. Physical traits repeated too. The same narrow shoulders, the same pale, almost translucent skin, the same eyes set just a little too close together, as if the face itself were trying to compress. Sarah grew up within a 5-mile radius of the main cabin. She never attended a real school. Her education came from her mother, Mary, and from watching the lives of women before her. She learned how to cook, how to tend a garden in poor soil, how to keep quiet when the older men spoke. She also learned what happened to Hutchkins women when they married. They got sick. They grew tired easily. Their bodies betrayed them in ways no one named out loud. As a child, Sarah's hands shook when she tried to hold small objects. The tremor was subtle, easy to hide if you kept your fists closed. Her teeth came in late and loose. She bruised easily. When she complained of pain in her joints, she was told it was growing pains, then later, God testing her strength. There was no language in that valley for genetics or inherited disorders. There were only patterns, and the unspoken agreement not to look at them too closely. On a cold morning in March, Douglas Hutchkins called the family together in the largest cabin. 14 people crowded into the room, the air thick with wood smoke and damp clothing. Sarah sat in the corner, her back straight, her hands folded to hide their shaking. She already knew what was coming. The Hutchkins daughters always did. Sarah will marry Thomas in June, her father said. His voice carried the weight of tradition, not affection. Thomas Hutchkins was her second cousin and her father's nephew, a man she had known all her life, a man whose face bore the same compressed features she saw every morning in the mirror. No one objected. No one ever did. The decision had been made long before it was spoken. The wedding was set in motion, and with it, the final tightening of a cycle that had been closing for over a century. Sarah's wedding dress was taken down from a cedar chest 2 weeks before the ceremony. The lace had yellowed with age, and when it was unfolded, a faint smell of mothballs and old wood filled the room. Her grandmother had worn it. So had her grandmother before that. Each woman who stepped into the dress carried the weight of the ones who came before, their bodies long returned to the soil behind the cabins. Sarah ran her fingers over the frayed hem and tried not to think about how few of them had lived past 30. Her younger sister Emma helped her dress on the morning of June 15, 1967. Emma was 14, thin and sharp-featured, with one eye that wandered when she was tired and a limp caused by a hip that had never formed correctly. She touched the fabric with careful hands, as if it might break. "Does it hurt?" Emma asked quietly. "The dress," Sarah said. Being chosen, Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror, nailed to the wall. Her skin looked almost gray in the morning light, stretched tight over bones that seemed too delicate to carry a life. "I don't know anything else," she finally said. It was the closest she came to honesty. The ceremony took place in a clearing behind the main cabin. 43 Hutchkins family members attended. No one else was invited. Douglas officiated, reading from a Bible that had been passed down through the family, its pages soft and thin from use. Thomas stood across from Sarah, his jaw shifting slightly as he swallowed, his eyes flicking toward the ground. When he slid the ring onto her finger, it hung loose. The women who had worn it before her had lost weight quickly after their marriages. The celebration lasted until nightfall. A fiddle played, the tune just slightly off. The bow guided by fingers that didn't quite bend the way they should. Children ran between the cabins, some limping, some moving with a jerky, uncoordinated rhythm. Laughter rose and fell, but underneath it ran a current of exhaustion. Hutchkins' gatherings always ended early. Bodies like theirs tired easily. When the sun disappeared behind the ridge, Sarah was led to the small cabin she would share with Thomas. The roof leaked when it rained. The walls let in cold even in summer. This was where she would live out her life, however long that turned out to be. As the door closed behind them, something else closed too, something invisible but final. 3 months into the marriage, Sarah began vomiting every morning. The family celebrated, assuming pregnancy. But the sickness didn't follow the familiar pattern. Her appetite vanished. Her skin took on a dull, ashen tone. Clumps of hair came away in her hands. Her teeth loosened in her gums. Mary recognized the signs immediately. She had seen them in her own mother, in her aunts, in women who married within the family and faded away. She said nothing. Naming it would mean admitting what everyone worked so hard not to see. By October, Sarah could barely walk. Her joints swelled grotesquely, fingers bending at angles that made simple tasks impossible. Thomas watched his bride deteriorate with a mixture of fear and confusion, but the family insisted this was normal. Hutchkins' women often got sick. They either recovered or they didn't. That was the way things were. When Douglas finally agreed to take her down the mountain to a doctor, the decision came not from concern, but from the undeniable fact that Sarah was no longer useful in her current state. The body that had been promised for children was breaking down too quickly, and even tradition had its limits. The drive down the mountain took over an hour, the truck grinding along a road that barely deserved the name. Sarah sat between her parents, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild air, her body shaking with a cold that came from somewhere deeper than the weather. Every bump sent a jolt of pain through her swollen joints. She bit her lip until it bled, refusing to cry out. Hutchkins' women learned early that sound didn't change outcomes. Dr. Harrison's office sat on the edge of town, a squat brick building that smelled of antiseptic and paper. He had been practicing in Harlan County for 2 decades. He knew the families. He knew the patterns. When Sarah was helped inside, he took one look at her and felt a familiar dread settle in his chest. He had seen this before, though never this severe in someone so young. The examination took nearly 2 hours. Blood was drawn. X-rays were taken. Sarah lay on the table, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks to keep herself from drifting away. Doctor. Harrison moved slowly, carefully, as if speed might make what he was seeing worse. Severe anemia, organ dysfunction, bone deformities that mimicked known diseases, but didn't quite match any of them. The blood panel showed markers he had only encountered in medical journals describing extreme cases from isolated populations. "How are you related to your husband?" he asked finally, keeping his voice neutral. "He's my cousin," Sarah said. Speaking felt like lifting a weight. "What kind of cousin?" "Second cousin. But his mama was my daddy's sister." Dr. Harrison closed his eyes for a moment. He had suspected, but hearing it spoken aloud made the implications unavoidable. The charts on his desk suddenly felt heavier. "Sarah," he said gently, Your body is attacking itself. Your immune system is compromised because of your family history. And you're pregnant. The word landed hard. Pregnant. The thing everyone had assumed, celebrated, demanded. Sarah's eyes widened. For a moment, something like hope flickered there. But you need to understand, he continued. The baby has a very high chance of severe abnormalities, and carrying it could kill you. Your body is already failing. Sarah thought of her mother, of her grandmother, of the graves on the hill. My mama had 7 babies, she said. My grandmama had 10. How many lived past 5? He asked quietly. She didn't answer. She had never counted, but the number rose unbidden in her mind. Too few. Harrison explained what he could in simple terms when Douglas stepped into the room. He spoke of inherited disorders, of recessive genes given too many chances to surface. He described what happens when a family tree collapses inward, when the same genetic material circulates without relief. You're saying we shouldn't marry our own? Douglas said flatly. I'm saying your family is destroying itself from the inside. The doctor replied. What you're seeing in Sarah isn't a disease. It's the result of generations of inbreeding. Douglas listened with the expression of a man hearing blasphemy. He stood, thanked the doctor without warmth, and took his daughter home. He did not repeat the words he'd heard. Instead, he told the family Sarah needed rest and prayer. God would decide the outcome. Sarah's body, already burdened by a century of choices, continued to tell a different story. Winter came early that year, settling over the mountains like a lid pressed down too hard. By November, Sarah's belly had begun to swell, round and unmistakable, while the rest of her seemed to wither away. Her collarbones jutted sharply beneath her skin, her face hollowed, eyes sinking back into their sockets until they looked too large, too knowing. It was as if the pregnancy were consuming her from the inside, drawing strength from a body that had none left to give. At night, the cabin filled with sounds that unsettled even the family. Sarah cried out in her sleep, long, hoarse moans that didn't sound fully human. Sometimes she spoke words no one understood, fragments of sentences that drifted between prayer and accusation. Mary said it was fever. Douglas said it was fear. No one said what they were all thinking, that something inside her was wrong in a way prayer couldn't reach. Strange habits began to surface. Sarah stopped eating solid food. She craved chalk scraped from the walls, dirt from the garden, bits of ash from the hearth. When Thomas tried to stop her, she hissed at him, a thin, animal sound that made him recoil. During the day, she sat by the window and watched the trees for hours without moving, her hands resting on her belly, as if she were guarding something fragile and dangerous at the same time. The family gathered often, laying hands on her, murmuring prayers passed down from generations who had faced the same slow unraveling. Candles burned low. Psalms were whispered until voices cracked. Outside, animals began to disappear. Chickens were found dead, necks twisted. A goat was discovered one morning stiff and cold, its eyes clouded over, no sign of attack. Some said predators. Others said it was a bad winter. No one connected it to the cabin where a young woman lay wasting away. By her 7th month, Sarah could no longer stand. Her legs swelled grotesquely, skin stretched tight and shiny. Her kidneys began to fail. Then her liver. The swelling in her joints made her fingers curl inward, nails digging into her palms. She smelled faintly of decay even while she breathed. Thomas sat beside her each night, holding her skeletal hand, watching her fade into something almost unrecognizable. "Am I being punished?" she whispered once. her voice barely more than air. For what? He asked, though the answer frightened him. For being born. Outside. Snow began to fall in earnest, cutting the compound off from the rest of the world. Roads vanished beneath drifts. The family was isolated again, just as they had always wanted to be. Inside the cabin, Sarah's breathing grew shallow and uneven. The child inside her shifted violently, movements too strong for a body so frail. By January, it was clear that whatever was coming would not wait for spring. The body that had been breaking itself down for months was nearing its limit. And when labor finally began, it did not come gently. It came like an eruption, sudden and relentless, tearing through a girl who had been trained all her life to endure in silence. The mountains listened as the screaming began again. Labor started in the deepest part of the night, January 14th, 1968, when the cold pressed hardest against the cabins and the snow lay piled high enough to swallow fences. Sarah's scream cut through the dark like something breaking loose. It wasn't rhythmic or measured. It was raw, panicked. The sound of a body realizing too late that it could not complete what was being demanded of it. Mary and two older women crowded around the bed, their faces drawn and pale in the lamplight. They had delivered dozens of Hutchkins babies between them. They knew the signs of trouble. Sarah's contractions came hard and fast, but there was no progress. Her body trembled violently, muscles spasming without coordination. Blood soaked through the sheets almost immediately, dark and thin, carrying the metallic smell of something already going wrong. Hours passed, then a full day. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her eyes rolling back, lips cracked and bleeding. She begged for water, then forgot she had asked. Her pulse fluttered weakly beneath Mary's fingers. The baby inside her was trapped, twisted in a position that no amount of prayer or whispered instruction could correct. By the second night, fear finally outweighed tradition. Thomas pulled on his coat, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fasten the buttons. He saddled the horse in near, whiteout conditions and rode down the mountain, pushing the animal past exhaustion. When he reached Dr. Harrison's house, he pounded on the door until his fists bled. "She's dying," he said when the door finally opened. "Please." Dr. Harrison knew the risk. The roads were impassable. The weather could kill them both. But he packed his bag anyway. They rode back up the mountain together, the horse slipping and struggling through drifts that swallowed its legs. Dawn was breaking when they arrived. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy with blood and sickness. Sarah lay barely conscious, her skin the color of ash. The smell of death had already settled in the room, unmistakable. Dr. Harrison examined her quickly. The baby was in distress. Sarah's blood pressure was dangerously low. Her organs were failing. There was no time. "I need to perform a surgical delivery," he said. "Here, now, or they both die." Douglas stepped forward, his face rigid. "God will decide." "God gave me hands and knowledge," the doctor replied. "Let me use them." The standoff lasted only seconds, but in that time, Sarah's breathing faltered. Mary broke first. "Save my daughter," she said, her voice cracking. Dr. Harrison worked with what he had. A table cleared in the corner. Kerosene lamps turned up high. No anesthesia, no sterile instruments. Just skill, urgency, and the terrible understanding that even success would come at a cost. Sarah didn't scream when the blade cut into her. She was too weak for that. Her eyes stared at nothing as the women held her down, their prayers dissolving into sobs. The baby emerged silent. For a moment, the room froze, every breath held. Then a weak, rasping cry broke through the stillness. thin and wrong, like a sound that hadn't fully learned how to exist. A girl. Harrison handed the child to Mary and turned back to Sarah. Blood poured from her body, refusing to clot, spilling out of her as if she were already letting go of life. He worked frantically, but her body had nothing left to give. As the sun crept over the frozen ridge, Sarah Hutchins slipped into stillness. Sarah Hutchins was pronounced dead at sunrise on January 16, 1968. 17 years old, married 7 months. Her body lay on the blood-soaked table, eyes half open, skin already cooling, as if death had only been waiting for permission. The women covered her with a sheet and stepped back. No one cried at first. Grief came slowly in that family. Weighed down by familiarity, the baby lived. That fact alone felt like defiance. Decay. Harrison stayed long enough to examine her by the thin morning light. What he saw tightened something deep in his chest. The child's face was split by a cleft palate, so severe it distorted her features into something almost unrecognizable. Her spine curved sharply to one side, a bend that would never straighten. One arm ended at the elbow, the hand never having formed. Her legs were different lengths, already setting the pattern for a lifetime of pain that would never be long enough to fully arrive. When he listened to her chest, he heard it immediately. Holes in the heart, blood moving where it shouldn't. A fragile system built to fail. She won't live long, he told Mary quietly. A year, maybe less. Mary cradled the baby, rocking back and forth, her face hollowed by decades of burying children. "How many more?" she asked. "How many more of us have to die before it stops?" Dr. Harrison looked around the cabin, webbed fingers, crossed eyes, bent spines, missing teeth, minds dulled by damage passed down so many times it had become normalized. "All of you," he said. "If nothing changes." Sarah's funeral was held 2 days later. 40 family members stood in the snow around a grave hacked out of frozen ground. Thomas held the baby, wrapped tight against the cold. The family sang a hymn, their voices thin and uneven in the open air. Douglas spoke of God's will, of obedience and endurance. He did not mention that Sarah had been a child bride. He did not mention that her husband was her cousin. He did not mention the pattern that had brought them all there. When the coffin was lowered, the ground swallowed it without ceremony. The baby was named Grace. She lived for 8 months. Long enough to smile, though the shape of her face turned it into something that looked like a grimace. Long enough to grasp at fingers with her one complete hand. Long enough for the family to love her despite everything. She died on September 3, 1968. Mary found her cold in the crib, her chest still, her heart finally giving out exactly as Dr. Harrison had warned. This time, he refused to let it pass quietly. He filed a report with the Kentucky State Health Department. He documented everything: the marriages, the deformities, the deaths, the generations of isolation. In November, a team of doctors and social workers arrived in Harlan County with court orders, an authority the mountains could not repel. They examined 43 Hutchins family members. Blood was drawn. Bodies were measured. Family trees were reconstructed until the lines tangled into something almost unreadable. The findings were catastrophic. The coefficient of inbreeding for the youngest generation was calculated at 0.25, the genetic equivalent of being born from full siblings. The family tree had not just collapsed, it had imploded. And for the first time, the town could no longer look away. The meetings took place in March of 1969, in the largest cabin on the compound. Charts and diagrams were spread across the rough wooden table, their clean lines at odds with the warped boards beneath them. Dr. Harrison stood with the state researchers, pointing to photographs the family had never seen arranged this way before. Their own children's bodies reduced to evidence, bent limbs circled in red, facial asymmetries measured and labeled, blood values highlighted where they fell far outside anything considered survivable. "This is what you've done," he said, his voice low and steady. "Generation after generation, you've concentrated harmful genes. Every child born into this family carries a heavier burden than the last." Douglas stared at the papers, his hands trembling with arthritis that had arrived decades too early. "We were keeping the family pure," he said. "You were making it fragile." Dr. Harrison replied, "Poor bloodlines aren't stronger. They're weaker. Diversity creates resilience. What you've built is a system that collapses under its own weight." Mary spoke then, her voice breaking through the quiet. "Can it be fixed? For those already born?" "No," the doctor said. "The damage is permanent. But if the family stops marrying within itself, if the next generation comes from outside, it can recover, slowly, over generations. And if we don't," asked one of the elders, "in 3 generations, there will be no Hutchkins family left," Dr. Harrison said. "The children will die younger. The defects will worsen." This line ends. The meeting ended without a decision. The elders said they needed time to pray, to consult the teachings of Elijah Hutchkins, to weigh tradition against words written by outsiders. Time, as it turned out, was the one thing they didn't have. 2 months later, 15-year-old Emma Hutchkins was told she would marry her first cousin that summer. Dr. Harrison heard about it through the social workers and drove up the mountain himself. He found Emma in the garden, pulling weeds from thin soil with hands that shook from a neurological condition she'd been born with. "You don't have to do this," he told her. She didn't look surprised. "What choice do I have?" "You can leave," he said. "There are programs, school, housing, and be alone," she said, "or stay and die by 30. She thought of Sarah, of Grace, of the graves on the hill. "My sister said it felt like drowning from the inside," Emma said quietly. "Is that what will happen to me?" "Yes," Dr. Harrison said, refusing to lie. Emma left that day. She walked away from the only life she had ever known, carrying a small bag and the weight of everyone who hadn't been able to follow. The state backed her decision. Douglas tried to stop her. Tradition failed where fear finally succeeded. Her departure cracked something open. If one could leave, others could too. By 1975, nearly half the compound was empty. Some carried their damaged genes into the wider world. Others stayed and continued the old ways. Emma married a man in Lexington, not a cousin. Their first child was born healthy, no deformities, no silent countdown in her blood. Emma cried when the doctor told her. She hadn't known life could begin without suffering. Back in the mountains, the cycle tightened around those who remained. The old ways finished their work quietly. In 1972, Douglas Hutchkins's youngest daughter married her second cousin. She died in childbirth 2 years later, her body failing in the familiar sequence. The baby lived 3 days. The grave was added to the hill without ceremony. Thomas Hutchkins never remarried. He stayed in the cabin where Sarah had died, living alone with the memory of a life that had never truly been his. By 40, his spine had curved sharply. His teeth fell out one by one. His mind began to slip into early dementia, memories dissolving the way so many Hutchkins bodies had before him. Dr. Harrison retired in 1978. Before he left Harlan County, he compiled a final report on the family. It became a landmark case study in medical genetics, cited in textbooks as an example of sustained inbreeding and genetic collapse. The family that had hidden for generations became known in academic circles as a warning written in blood and bone. By 1985, only 17 Hutchkins remained in the compound. The youngest was 42. No children had been born there in 8 years. The family, in its original form, was dying out exactly as predicted. Douglas died in 1987 at 69, an old man by Hutchkins' standards. At his funeral, those who had stayed stood apart from those who had left. Two versions of the same bloodline facing each other across a grave. Mary spoke. She was 71, her survival an anomaly. "We thought we were preserving something sacred," she said. "We poisoned ourselves with our own pride. We killed our children with our traditions." She gestured to the stones around them. 40, 6 markers. 40, 6 lives cut short. Then she looked at Emma and her children. Maybe leaving wasn't betrayal. Maybe staying was. The compound was abandoned in 1992. Cabins collapsed. Paths vanished. The cemetery remained. But even the stones began to sink, names fading back into the earth. In 2010, a journalist found Emma and asked if she regretted leaving. Emma watched her grandchildren play, healthy and unburdened. "I regret that Sarah never had a choice," she said. Leaving wasn't regret. It was survival. Today, the Hutchkins story lives on in journals and databases, reduced to charts and coefficients. But the real record is in the soil of those mountains. Sarah Hutchkins died at 17. Her body poisoned by a century of closed bloodlines. Her stone doesn't say that. It only lists dates. The rest was buried with her. What would you do if you discovered the person who gave you life was also the one who stole it? The mountains don't answer. They never have. There is nothing left to excavate in that hollow now. No cabins, no voices. Just a slope where the ground dips unnaturally, as if the earth itself is tired of holding what was placed into it. When fog settles there in the early morning, it moves low and slow, curling through the trees the way breath once curled from dying mouths. Locals still avoid the place. They say the air feels wrong, too heavy, as if something unfinished is still pressing upward from beneath the soil. Records name it a case study, a collapsed pedigree, an extreme coefficient. Clean words, precise words, built to keep emotion out. But those words never learned Sarah's face. They never heard Grace struggle for breath. They never watched a 15-year-old girl walk away from her blood, because staying meant dying slowly and calling it faith. What happened to the Hutchkins family was not sudden. It was not a single crime or a single decision. It was a long obedience to a lie, the lie that purity protects, the lie that isolation preserves, the lie that suffering repeated often enough becomes sacred. Generation after generation carried it forward, not because they were cruel, but because no one taught them how to stop. Sarah's body did not fail her on her wedding night. It failed her at conception. Every cell carried instructions written decades before she was born. Her marriage only accelerated what was already inevitable. The body kept dying because it had never been allowed to be fully alive. Somewhere, in a genetics lecture hall, her family tree still appears on a screen, lines looping back, names repeating, a warning rendered in ink and light. Students study it, nod, take notes, and move on. But the mountains remember differently. They remember screams. They remember graves dug too small. They remember a tradition that mistook closeness for strength and produced only decay. If you were born into that hollow, into that blood, into that closed circle, with no clear edge, would you have stayed? Or would you have walked away, knowing survival meant becoming a stranger to your own name. The question lingers there, unanswered, drifting through the trees, long after the family itself has vanished.